Hi. In this video, we explore closures in JavaScript. Now, closures are fairly common, but apart from being common, they are also confusing. So, in this video, we'll understand the overarching concept of closures. So, in the process, we'll explore different scenarios and understand how closures act in various scenarios. But towards the end, we'll bring all those scenarios together to understand what closure actually is, what its crux is. So let's get started. Let's forget about closure for a moment. Let's just focus on lexical scope. So here we have a function foo which has a variable a and another function bar defined inside the function foo itself. And bar just logs the value of a. The definition of bar is able to access the value of a because bar itself is inside the lexical scope of foo. What about the calling of bar? The call is also happening from inside the scope of foo itself. So that's why whenever we are calling the value of bar, it can very easily print the value of a, like you can see here. This is not really closure in action, it's more of lexical scope in action. But the point to note here is that lexical scope are the starting point of closures. Closure in reality is present here, but that's not very obvious in this example. Let's move on to an example now where closure is more obvious. Let's take another example where we have the same function foo which had variable a and function bar defined. This time, however, the calling of bar is outside the function foo. So function foo returns bar as the return. So basically, function as a var stores the reference of bar, and then later we call function bar through this function as a var. But before checking the output of this call, let's see if the variable a is accessible from outside the function foo or not. Note that I have defined a with the keyword let, not with var. And now I'm trying to access a from outside the function foo. As you can see here, there is a reference error, and rightly so, because we are trying to access a variable declared with let keyword from outside its own scope. Now, let's see what happens when we try to access the same variable a through function as a var. Function as a var, just to repeat, is the reference of the function bar that foo returns. So essentially, calling function as a var would be calling the function bar and will try to access the value of a through the console.log. In this case, it seems that somehow the function as a var is able to access the value of a, even though this line wasn't able to access the value of a. Why is that happening? The answer to this why is the closure. This is an example where closure is more obvious. In effect, let's see what actually is happening under the hood. So, at this point, why were we not able to access a in the first place? Because when calling console.log a, the execution of function foo was already over. Since the execution of function foo was already over, that means everything inside the scope of function foo is also over. That's why by the time we call the console.log a, there is no a that exists anymore. But what's happening here then? Even here, the scope of foo should have been over because its call is over. But something else seems to be happening parallelly. Let's zoom into that part. When we are returning the function foo, we are essentially returning the reference of bar. So at this point of return, it's as if there is a snapshot taken of the reference bar, which is stored in the function as a var. This function as a var, in storing the reference of bar, actually stores the entire scope of bar, which was present at that time. What was the scope of bar? Scope of bar was the scope of entire function foo, which also included the variable a. So at a later point of time, even when the execution of function foo is over, because we're executing the snapshot function as a var, that's why it's still able to access the value of a. So essentially, this is what we call closure or closing over. Whenever we are passing the reference of a function, not necessarily function, it can be any other entity. Whenever we are passing the reference of an entity, in this case, which in this case is bar, that entity's snapshot, which includes its scope, is stored for the future. This is what we call closing over or closure. Bar, in that sense, closes over the scope of foo. It surrounds the scope of foo, and therefore it has access to the scope of foo, everything that's inside its scope, and then takes a snapshot of the scope at that point in time so that it can be referenced in the future, even after the function whose scope's snapshot it took ceases to exist. Let's take another example where we have a demo function and inside it we have a setTimeout, whose callback is the delayed function. Delayed function simply logs something to the console. So in this case, delayed function closes over demo, like we had bar closing over the function foo. So in closing over the scope of demo, it has access to everything that exists inside demo scope, which includes message, and which is what it logs to the console. Note that in this case, we do not really return the delayed function like we used to do with bar. In this case, JavaScript's engine itself calls setTimeout, and in the process calls delayed function after an interval of 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds in this case. So what's really happening in this? Let's zoom in. When we call the demo function, immediately it also calls the setTimeout function. And in the setTimeout function, it assigns this delayed function as its callback. This happens during the execution of demo, where delayed function is assigned as the callback. After the specified number of milliseconds have elapsed, this callback function that was assigned to the setTimeout is then executed. By this time, after 2 seconds, the demo function's execution is definitely over, for sure. And so its scope, including message, is also over. But because during its execution, the delayed function was assigned to its callback, that delayed function stored the scope of demo as its snapshot. So when the delayed function is actually executed, when the callback function is actually executed after 2 seconds, that snapshot is able to access the message parameter. So if I run this from 2 seconds after running this code, 1, 2, closure in action, or basically the delayed function is called. So this is another example of closure in action, where during the execution of a function, demo in this case, a second function was assigned as its callback function. The snapshot of that function was saved, which included the message parameter. And after this specified amount of time has elapsed, that callback function will be called. And through that snapshot, the demo function's scope will be still accessible. Demo function's scope continues to live even after its execution is over before 2 seconds. Taking the previous example of the setTimeout a little further, let's see how it behaves if we put it inside a for loop. The principle is same here. again, we have a set timeout, which has a delayed function, which does something inside its business logic. This delayed function, this time, closes over the scope of the for block. What's different about the for block here? Because this is a for loop this time, so the delayed function, which closes over the for loop, will take the snapshot of this for block for 5 times, which includes the value of I. So essentially, the value of I will be reassigned for 5 times during the course of its execution. Now, what is I? I, if we have a closer look here, is the value which it prints in console.log, but also I is the value of delay of the set timeout. So essentially, for snapshot 1, which will be executed after 1 second, the value will be 1. For snapshot 2, the value of I will be 2 into 1000, 2000 millisecond, and so on. Let's run this code. 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second, 5 second. So yeah, that's how closures behave, be it in a block scope or be it in a loop scope. Closure is about taking the snapshot of the scope of an entity, for block in this case, by another entity, delayed function, which closes over the for block. So moving on to the final example of this video, there is a greet function which has a create greeting inside it. Because of closure, create greeting will be closing over the scope of the greet function, and hence will be able to access greetings value even after greet has completed its execution. So let's run first and see what's happening. At this point, line number 11 and 12, what we are doing is we are calling the outer function greet, which is returning the reference of create greeting. Create greeting in turn has a closure over greet. So these two values, morning greeting and evening greeting, store the reference of create greeting, which are actually the snapshots of greet that the create greeting has a closure over. So essentially, these two snapshots will be storing the value of greeting exactly the way they were passed in their respective executions. Now, at a later point in time, when we are actually calling these references, it will remember the value of good morning and good evening. It will remember the value of basically this greeting. And since we are using the value of greeting in its return value, at this point, the value of greeting will be correctly printed, which is what this part is. Good morning and good evening are correctly printed. Note that at this point, the executions of greet function are long over. It's just that because the closure of create greeting saved the snapshot of the scope of the greet function and its greeting parameter. Here, that's why greeting parameters values, good morning and good evening, are accessible from this point, which is what is printed here. So this is about the scope over the value of an entity. The other dimension is that closures do not only happen for the values, it also happens for access, which we can see in action in this example itself. See that when create greeting was closing over the scope of greet function, it also had this value time in its snapshot. Now, after this point, when the greet's execution was over, going by the rules, morning greeting and evening greeting would still have the access to the variable time because of closure. This access is what it's able to access at a later time and is able to set its value to something at a later time when we call these references of create greeting, morning greeting and evening greeting. It's passing some values of time to t and the value of t is assigned to time. How is it able to assign the value of t to something which existed in the scope of greet? It's because of closure again. Because in the snapshot, the access, not the value, because time did not have any value in the first place. The snapshots save the access of time variables as well. Therefore, now it's able to access the time variable and set something to it. In this case, it's setting something that we are passing from this point. And it's rightly able to output the values to the console. So that's what closure is. Closure is about taking the snapshot of an entity in its entirety, which includes not only its value, but also its access. So that's what we explored in this video. We took various examples of closure to see how closure behaves in different scenarios. The overarching concept of closure is that closure comes into play at any point whenever the scope of an entity, such as foo or demo in this example, the scope continues to live well after it should have ended. This is because a second entity, such as bar or the delayed function in this example, closes over the scope of the first entity. This second entity that closes over is then passed and called from outside of its own lexical scope. Whenever this is called from outside of its own lexical scope, it becomes very much obvious that the entity of which it closes over, the original function, the foo or the demo, the scope of the original entity is very much alive. So, in that sense, the closure or the closing over of the second entity over the first entity is the cause, and the effect is that through the scope of the second entity, the first entity, the original entity continues to live. By closing over the original entity, the second entity ensures that the original entity's scope remains very much alive. So yes, that's what I wanted to share in this video. I hope you got some clarity on what closure is, what its crux is. Thank you so much for watching this video.